Okay, welcome back everyone. It is 12/8 of 2015. We're going to take a look at a very important lesson on Aristotle. We're going to take a look at Aristotle's Doctrine of Episteme. And we want to be very precise when we say this, but it is going to be a Doctrine of Episteme. And it's going to be articulated by three separate authors. Three separate essays compiled in the Companion to Aristotle by Blackwell Publishing in 2009. It's going to be an essay by Robin Smith, by Michael Farragon, and by Paolo Crivelli. Those three essays are going to contribute to a doctrine of episteme for Aristotle, which is going to be very comprehensive. We're going to examine it through a series of moments. We're going to pass through the prior analytics, then the posterior analytics, and then the soul dealing with empiricism, the soul dealing with signification, and then the final moment of episteme as the true, as discernment and the true. And so before we even begin, let's get our picture, let's get a very brief snapshot of where we're headed. And if you look in the center of the chart, you'll see the three circles that we're familiar with. It's the block numbered Roman numeral 3. And you notice that we're going to work with the logic, first of all, as the prior and the posterior logic. And then we're going to deal with empiricism and signification, and that's going to lead us to episteme as the truth, as the notion of the true. So we're going to go from logic to empiricism to signification. From logic to empiricism to signification, and that will yield a doctrine of episteme. We want to begin in the first moment, which is going to be a demonstration in itself as the syllogism. And this is going to be an articulation of prior analytics. And we begin by examining some basic Greek concepts. Episteme for Aristotle equals scientific knowledge. For Aristotle, philosophical knowledge is science. He is articulating a doctrine which is a science, a scientific knowing. An apodexis is a proof consisting of the possession of spirit and power. So it's a presentation of episteme truth through spirit and through power. And it is a making and a showing forth of this truth through the syllogismos, or syllogisms, which will present our reasoning, our discernment, and our inward debate with the self that we want to present. In other words, we're going to present a syllogistic logic consisting of two premises and a conclusion, which is going to represent scientific knowledge. Even though it's philosophical knowledge, it's the science of philosophical knowledge for Aristotle, because it is presented as a syllogismos presentation of two premises and a conclusion. By using that format, it equals scientific knowing. Now note too the five requirements for the two premises. They have to be true, they have to be primary or immediate, they have to be completely unmediated, and they have to be more familiar than the conclusion that will result, and they have to be the causality of that conclusion. So those are the requirements for the two premises. Now the Greek concepts for the premises, first we've got the amoristas, which means they are primary or immediate or unmediated. And then norimos, and norimoteron means that these premises are going to be a part of the self's pre-understanding. The two premises that we formulate are a part of our pre-understanding of the categories that we already hold in our long-term memory. We've already done some work of knowledge, some work of discernment throughout our life. We do have some previously understood categories of understanding. We have some previous notions of the true that we have stored in our long-term memory. So our premises are going to evolve out of our pre-understanding as first principles that evolved out of our habits of virtue through our actions and our thought processes. And we're going to be dealing with the idea, or the cause, or the reason for conclusion. So we're going to deal with these first principles, which are going to be basically the ideal forms in reality, but they're going to be the ideal forms, or the eidos forms, as moving principles, principles of movement that cause the conclusion to be brought forth. So they're going to have a built-in self-actualization causality to them, and this self-actualization causality is going to cause the conclusion to necessarily evolve. But these two premises with this power to self-actualize are going to be drawn up out of our pre-understanding. So we have a summary of the theory of demonstration in three aspects for Note 4. It is a science. We're dealing with a science that consists of knowledge possessing a demonstration. We're going to demonstrate the notion of the true through two self-actualizing premises that will bring about a conclusion as a necessary conclusion. It'll be syllogistic, and it will be a syllogism consisting of immediate premises that are true in themselves, and using the premises drawn from our pre-understanding that was acquired through our habits of virtue in our previous engagements in actuality and in thought. So we're dealing very much with a science, according to Aristotle. It is a logical science, a philosophical knowing which is scientific, and it is scientific because it is syllogistic, and it is a syllogistic science that is reaching towards signification. It is a science, it is logically syllogistic, and that makes it a science, and it's reaching for a necessary conclusion which will be a signifier of the true. So that's our beginning, that's our logical beginning, and that all gets articulated by Aristotle in his prior analytics. And so if you wanted to examine his prior analytics in their totality, it would deal with this very prior moment of logic, of dealing with a syllogistic presentation and syllogistic construction of our possible intellect trying to achieve a signification of the true. Now in Block 2 we're going to take a look at this demonstration going out of itself as that causality, that power of self-actualization and necessity that our two premises contain. So we know we're going to form a syllogistic demonstration. How does this syllogistic demonstration self-actualize? How does the syllogism, the logical syllogism, which is our presentation out of our possible intellect that wants to achieve true signification of the true, how does that self-actualize? Well, in the second moment, we notice that we're dealing with posterior analytics now. In the first moment, we dealt with the syllogism in prior analytics. Now we deal with the causal necessity in the posterior analytics. We're also going to transition from discussing the eidos forms to discussing the eidos ideal forms as principles of movement, or what Aristotle calls arche. Now we're dealing with, rather than eidos, now we're dealing with arche, first principles. We're dealing with first principles of self-actualizing movement toward signification. We're dealing with arche, which is first principle cause. In Note A, arche equals first principle cause. They are kathauta, which means they are self-actualizing in virtue of their own power, and they feature essential predication. In other words, they generate through itself predication by means of which the individual can acquire the eidos form. So how do we perceive the ideal eidos form in reality, in our historical reality? We perceive it because any true universal eidos form will exhibit necessary attributes which will make that eidos form visible to those who view life spiritually. The higher spiritual attributes of universality will become visible. Aristotle says that any eidos form will of necessity exhibit its essential attributes, or what Aristotle calls it, through itself predication. Any eidos form of universality will present through itself predication and exhibit these essential attributes that will illumine the self's mind and allow us to perceive the presence of the eidos forms. And so in note 3, we are concerned with the acquisition of this universal truth, of these eidos forms of universal truth. And for Aristotle, the eidos forms did exist in perceptible reality, in perceptible things. He rejected the separate realm of eidos forms that Plato had posited, and he rejected the idea of a prior innate knowledge of eidos forms. For Aristotle, the true is in the reality we live in now. It is the spiritual realm veiled behind the sensate realm. There's a spiritual realm that presents the eidos forms, the essential attributes. And it is because the eidos forms have causal power to make themselves exist. They do self-actualize their attributes of essence for other selves to take up. So they do possess causal necessity. And this causal necessity operates through a self, says Aristotle, through the self's sentient soul and through the self's intellective soul. So self-actualization takes place through the subject. Self-actualization takes place through a subject, and it's going to be through our sentient and intellective soul. We acquire the eidos forms through perception and examining those through itself predicates that are being exhibited in our reality. Then we know where to target the eidos form. Now the modality of perception and causal necessity in note 4. In other words, if we articulate the axiomatic procedure, we can take a look at note 4a, positing a possible intellect. We investigate the universal truth by examining those through itself attributes that are being exhibited in our external reality. And we're able to postulate a possibility of eidos universality. Then we form logical propositions as premises. We acquire the ta koina, or the communal elements of a subject matter, and form our premises. So if we can examine the through itself attributes, then we can begin to group those attributes that commune with each other, that are drawn to each other in a communal unity, and that communal unity is that which points to the eidos form. The ta koina aspect of the through itself attributes point us to a communal eidos form, which will help us to form our premises. Now the conclusive signification and notion of the true, we eventually form a notion of the true based on these premises. And so we've got note D, the pistis or pistuo, faith conviction. Our conclusion that evolves out of these premises also will inform our motivational base of faith in the intellective soul. There's always a leap of faith for Aristotle because we're dealing with the kathalu, or universals that are just beyond conceptualization, or universals that don't really speak They are beyond conceptualization. That's the paradox. The paradox for Aristotle is that we seek to acquire the eidos forms of universality, but the paradox is that they do not speak. They are beyond conceptualization. They are the kathalu, and the kathalu are the non-speaking universals. The non-speaking universals that are beyond conceptualization. They are veiled by the sensate. They are beyond the finite. We can eschatologically anticipate them. We can, in a faith-type leap of faith, we can posit them. And so it's always a leap of faith moment for Aristotle. That leaves us a triad at the bottom of Block 2 that kind of gets us started on this process of episteme. In the first moment, the soul and presentation, the through itself attributes of the eidos forms. The self possesses an intentionality of episteme. We do seek to know the universal eidos forms, to acquire those eidos forms, and the sensate things present to us in reality the through itself attributes of the eidos forms of universality. So in the first moment we have our existence in the sensate realm as a self that intends to possess universality. And we have the things in sensate reality that present the through itself attributes of eidos forms to lead us and illuminate us toward apprehending those universalities. Then we got the work of the soul. Block 2, the intellect of soul forms the premises. The self, we partition out the ta koina, or the communal elements of those attributes that point to the eidos forms, and we can actually formulate immediate premises of the truth concerning categories. We can form our two premises that seek a conclusion. But then we have to work from there in basically taking a leap of faith, because signification isn't simply logical progression. It's logical progression, self-actualizing logical progression, but it's through the self's intellective soul, and that through the self-intellective soul includes our leap of faith, because the universal truly is beyond conceptualization. So we follow the pointing of the premises, we follow the pointing of those through itself attributes, and that ta koina, communal element, that adheres those through itself attributes together, and we get a picture of the kathalu, the universal that does not speak, the kathalu that disappears in the moment we seek to grasp it. We make it out, but we make it out eschatologically, as that which is beyond the gaze of our horizon, but through our leap of faith and through our thoughtful and dialectical examination of where those eidos forms point, we can form a horizon-based eschatological conclusion as our notion of the true concerning these eidos forms that we have grasped. So blocks 1 and 2 give us logic. We've dealt with logic. Basically, it's that part of Aristotle's philosophy that's kind of boring to a lot of people, but it's the logic. He begins with logic. The prior logic, the prior analytics, the posterior logic, the analytics, the posterior analytics. He deals with the syllogism and the self-actualizing causality of the syllogism in the analytics. That's the logic. But from the logic, we push on out of speculative logic into the real, concrete, empirical world. So now we're going to move into the empirical world in Block 4. That's going to be our next stop. So here we are on our journey toward episteme truth, episteme scientific philosophical knowing. We have a speculative logical procedure which is going to be syllogistic. It's going to be self-actualizing, but it's going to self-actualize through my soul, through the soul of the self. It's going to self-actualize through the sentient soul, and through the intellective soul. So when we move into the empirical realm, we're moving into the empirical realm and the work of the soul within the empirical realm. So note, Block 4 deals with empiricism, where actual demonstration comes forth, and it begins with the pre-existing cognitive state. For Aristotle, there is a pre-existing cognitive state. We begin with a possible intellect, or what he calls a hexis dunamis. A hexis dunamis, hexis means cognitive state, and dunamis means potentiality. So it's a possible intellect. We have a possible intellect, and the self possesses this possible intellect, which for Aristotle means we have the capability innately present within us to grasp and to shape the eidos forms. It's built in. We have an innate possible intellect, an inherent power of a possible intellect, of a hexis dunamis. We possess, that's our image of God. We have a hexis dunamis soul, a possible intellect. And we're going to enter into a process, first of all, of empiricism. Now, empiricism means that for Aristotle, and this is key because this is the distinction between Plato and Aristotle. For Aristotle, episteme begins with the empirical. It doesn't begin with an ideal eidos form realm up in heaven. It begins here in empirical reality. So realism, even though Aristotle does posit an idealism, it's an idealism that is an incarnate idealism. He begins with the empiricism. Episteme begins in the empirical. And the empiria includes two functions. It includes aesthesis, the process of the self internalizing the sensations. And this is important. This is our sentient soul, as phantasia, psychical images. So we receive sensate data, and the sentient soul, the sentient mind, forms that into a psychical image, a feeling percept. A lot of times you'll hear this in logic as feeling percept. But for Aristotle, it's a phantasia, psychical image, a phantasa or a phantasm. For Aristotle, it's a phantasm. So these feeling percepts are phantasms. That's the first signifier that we form. We form a phantasm based on the sensate data we receive from our reality. Then we move into neme, which is the memory workspace for gathering these phantasms into a kind of a hierarchy of their significance. We kind of arrange them into a workspace, kind of a short-term memory holding place, a neme of a hierarchy for these phantasms, which are basically feeling percepts, which will become intelligible as generalizations when they reach the intellective soul. But right now, they simply begin as, for Aristotle, phantasia, psychical images, or phantasms. That's how they begin for Aristotle. But that's something stored in the possible intellect. But in note 3, the possible intellect transitions to the active intellect, or what Aristotle calls nous, which is mind, and we take those phantasms and we convert them to intelligible objects as intellectual or intellective generalizations, particular class generalizations. And the task for Aristotle is to take the leap of faith. And the leap of faith is going to take the generalization and raise it up, egeiro in Greek. We're going to raise it up to signification. And that's the goal, to raise generalization to signification. And so note 4, key for Aristotle, is the concept of immanence. Empiricism for Aristotle is simply the initial empiricism that gathers the content for the episteme process, but eithesis still does perceive the kathalu as an immanent universal, as an incarnate universal of the eidos form. So Aristotle does posit an idealism, but it's not an idealism up there in the metaphysical world. It's an ideality that is incarnate and immanent in each very concrete empirical thing. That puts us out of the speculative logic into the realm of a beginning in empiricism, but as we discovered in the logic, Aristotle says we must take a leap of faith because the kathalu is beyond conceptualization. There's a little bit of a leap of faith that is implied when we try to grasp that which cannot be grasped, that which denies speaking in finite language, that which hides and makes it difficult for us to see in our gaze over the horizon. So we're going to move into block 5, which is going to be signification. The signification is going to be a leap of faith out of empiricism. So next we'll take a look at block 5. Now in block 5 we look at signification. Now we're looking at actual demonstration from the sentient empiricism transitioning to an intellective signification, and we're going to begin by examining 4 aspects of what it means to raise a generalization to a signification. Aristotle says there's a pause. The sign is acquired in the existential pause between self and audience, or what would be the realm of positing, an internal externality where we posit our notion of the true. It will concern object and thought. The sign will signify 2 things, the object and the thought of intentionality included in the object. And signification does involve motivational base. These thoughts are called the affectations of the soul, or affections of the soul, and are taken up by the sign as reflecting the self's motivational base of conviction. So our signs are also going to be representations of our conviction concerning the overall true, a kind of a horizon type conviction, an overarching genus that will help us to shape the structure of our lexical network of signs. Now when we look at language of signification, words as tokens represent the affectations or affections of the soul, and graphe is the inscription which represents the token as speech act. Now, phantasm, sensate object creates the sensate objects that affect us and affect our sentient soul become psychical. They create a psychical effect on the sentient soul, and that results in us creating those phantasia, image likenesses, or what we discovered were phantasms that we store in the sentient workspace. We acquire these phantasms, these feeling percepts. But then we're going to take the leap into the rational, and the phantasm is what the intellective rational soul takes as a generalization and raises it to signification. And that will lead us to that place of pause, that pause between the speaker and the audience, the realm of positing, or what we understand in philosophy as the realm of an internal externality, that which we believe about externality that is at the forefront of our mind, the filter through which we view all reality. So now we're ready to formulate that notion of the true in the realm of positing. That's going to be block 6, which is episteme, our knowing, our understanding. Episteme means knowing, understanding, scientific truth, or scientific knowledge, philosophical knowledge as a science. So now, actual demonstration. We take the lexical network of signs that we've created, and that lexical network of signs self-actualizes because it includes its own internal power to provoke out of the self a state of affairs as a positing. The self-actualization modalities of our acquired signs consist of the following. The signs will explain a true category. They bear those necessary attributes that illuminate our thinking, and they provoke a phronesis stance or a practical wisdom that will provoke the self to form propositional truth. Note 2, we form simple assertions about the sensate essences of sensate things and the ideal categories of the eidos forms. We also form, though, composite assertions, says Aristotle, about the structure that links those essences or those eidos forms together in an eschatologically constructed model with a eschatological horizon. So, note C, we end up positing a sign model of our notion of the true that defines the composite relation between form and matter, the eidos ideality of form and matter, as a holistic state of affairs that becomes an ideal model that we want to use to lift the reality we live in toward a higher good. The ideal for Aristotle is always the good, the agathos. So we form our ideal notion of the true as a sign model of a state of affairs, which interrelates the eidos forms into a movement, a model of eschatological movement toward the horizon that is always just beyond conceptualization, the universal horizon toward the agathos good that is always a universal that speaks, that gives us inclinations and hints, but doesn't quite speak completely. It's always just slightly out of our conceptualization, and that gives us the final moment of episteme. So we learn in these three essays that Aristotle's doctrine of episteme is very much a doctrine of logic, empiricism, signification. If you remember that triad, you'll have the snapshot. Episteme equals logic, empiricism, signification. We begin with a intentionality to actualize a syllogistic logic. We intend to do a science of syllogistic logic. But we begin in the realism world of empiricism. We begin in the empirical, realistic world of realistic things, but those realistic things exhibit essential properties that illuminate the eidos form that we're trying to acquire. And initially we can acquire those eidos forms, but initially as phantasms, as psychical affections on our sentient soul. But for Aristotle, faith is very much a part of philosophy, and we will take a leap of faith. Faith doesn't just involve religion. There's a leap of faith in philosophy. We will take a leap of faith from phantasm to signification. It'll pass through generalization, but it's a leap of faith from phantasm to signification.